What is going on, my people? I'm John Middlekauff. This is I'm the host of 3 and Out Podcast. You can find it below in the description here on the Volume Sports Network. You can also, we put it all on the YouTube page. You can subscribe to that as well. Share it with your friends. And let's dive into today's topics. Okay, I wanted to start with an interesting nugget I saw this weekend on this little thing they call the internet. And the Broncos are for sale right now because Pat Bowlen passed away, and they've been, if you're a Bronco fan, you follow it probably much closer than I do. It's been one of the bigger stories, I'm sure, in the city of Denver and just the state of Colorado. I mean, the Broncos are a historic brand in the NFL. And everything going on with Bolin's kids, whatever, the league has tried to get involved and just trying to facilitate a sale of the Denver Broncos. And the article that I saw this weekend was that one of the Waltons, they own this thing called Walmart. It's a pretty successful company, prints a lot of money. All the children are typically, top 20 richest people in this country. They've done pretty well for themselves. Walmart pushes a lot of product, is interested in buying it, and is prepared to make an offer over $4 billion. Now, just because the NFL is unique, right? If I wanted to buy your house and I made an offer so great you couldn't refuse, you'd give it to me. If you own a business and your business is worth $1 million and I offer you $5 million, you're probably taking the $5 million. But the NFL does not necessarily just give their team away to the highest bidder. They're going to pick and choose, right? Now, ideally, money, you couldn't, just because the NFL wanted you to own the team and you were only going to offer $2.5 billion, you wouldn't get the team because ultimately the family has to sign off on it. But the NFL likes placing people, right? David Tepper was a minority owner, I think, with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Jimmy Haslam, same thing. Those guys were in the country club of the National Football League. So I can't speak to league matters if this guy is guaranteed to get the brand, the team, to be the owner of the Denver Broncos. But I think it shows you that just a couple years ago, David Tepper purchased the Carolina Panthers for $2.2 billion. To me, it was fascinating because he paid cash. He gave cash for the team. Now, Walton's could easily too. I read that, I think Tim Walton was his name, is worth $70 billion. Because I saw a bunch of people like, $4 billion, that's pretty crazy. Well, yeah, $70 billion, you do the math. I don't know exactly what, but if you were worth $700,000, I don't know what the equivalent of that would be, but it wouldn't be very much money. It's a drop in the bucket to the guy. But one thing, it's just very clear that this team is going to go for an astronomical amount of money. And the number one thing that jumps out to me, and listen, if you've listened to me for a while, I've been relieved of my duties before. I have been fired multiple times, once in the NFL and once in the dying business of terrestrial radio. And both times, they were when new management came in. Obviously, Chip Kelly with the Philadelphia Eagles, and then I got this new kind of program director, they're called, in radio. Now, those people, unlike in this situation, didn't own the team, but in Chip's situation, gave full power. In the radio situation, this guy's the boss. He gets ownership over the operation. And anyone that's listening to this knows if you work in an industry where, management or ownership has changed, everyone in the building, is a little on edge. There's some unknown. There are no scholarship players in the private sector, unless you're great. And when you're great, everyone wants to keep you at all moments. But when there is any question mark, when there's any butting of heads, when there's ever any philosophical differences, changes are made. And sometimes when ownership changes hands, it doesn't just have to be the NFL. There's a natural change just because people want to institute their own people. People want, if I'm going to spend this amount of money, I want some of my own people or people I know or people I'm comfortable with or people that I hired to be running certain situations, right? To be running certain parts of the business. And so when I see that this, now it's basically official, that this team is going off the market, I would say in the next 6 months. someone will own the Denver Broncos, whether it's a Walton or whether it's some other billionaire. And that guy is going to ultimately want his own people in there sooner than later. So the number one thing that stood out to me was the Denver Broncos don't have Mike Shanahan as their head coach. They don't. This guy's not going to inherit Sean Payton or Bill Belichick, a guy with a ton of equity in the fan base. They have this younger, energetic, first-time head coach. Zero equity. And here's the other problem. Their general manager, who's highly respected, I think is pretty good at his job, was hired once upon a time by John Elway, who now really isn't even associated with the operation. Now, if these guys win, probably won't be any issues. It's easy for the owner to just keep these guys on and keep rocking and rolling. But when this general manager just made a pretty historic trade for a player who, get ready for this, Russell Wilson is going to get an extension, whether that's before the draft, whether that's after the draft, whether that's in training camp, it's coming. They are going to make a large financial commitment to Russell Wilson. That's a fact. That is coming. So all their chips are in the middle of the table on this player with this new head coach and this general manager. Well, here's the thing. They don't fire players, especially your highest paid player who's going to have a ton of guaranteed money. He's safe, right? See it in the NBA all the time. You don't fire LeBron, but you sure as hell fire his coach, and he's fired a lot of them. So Russell Wilson, once he signs this new extension, is going to be safe 4 years. Whether it goes good, now you would say based on his career, should go pretty good. But, you never know. Sometimes these trades, a player is no longer what he once was. We saw signs of it last year. He wasn't running as much as he used to. To me, I've seen him in some pictures. I saw him at the Denver Bronco game or the Denver Nugget game, dapping up the MVP Jokic. And Russell looks a little chubby to me, just a little overweight. And he's shorter, so he kind of wears it. But regardless, he's going nowhere. There's immediate pressure on the head coach and the general manager. This team needs to win. This team needs to win now. I've said it forever. There is going to be a team in the AFC West who is highly disappointing. And that team may end up going 9-8. Look at last year, the Chargers. They went 9-8. It was a disaster. Missing the playoffs with a top 5 quarterback, losing to the Raiders, who had an interim coach who had their star wide receiver in jail. Like that's hard to shake. Now, you make the playoffs this year, you win the division, people will forget. The Denver Broncos have been really shitty for a while, but everyone's been hyping up their talent, and rightfully so. They have some good players, but now you add the quarterback. To me, the general manager, he hires this coach, and he went all in on it. They did a big, if you follow them on social media, they did in-depth features. He really likes the guy. And listen, I'm rooting for him. UC Davis, bald guy. But man, if you go 8-9 year one, someone spends $4 billion on a team, wouldn't shock me if the coach is one and done, given the pressure and just the scrutiny that's going to be on this franchise with a brand new owner. It's just the way it happens, just the way it rolls. It's just there's no way around it. There's a pretty consistent theme in the NFL when it comes to new ownership. Let's go to Carson Wentz. And I think the key as a general manager is to understand the market, whether that's free agency or whether that's the draft. Because ultimately your role, like the coach's role, is to coach the team, right? To inspire the team schematically, inspirationally. They are the leader of the squad. As the general manager, your job is to run the personnel department and have your franchise ready basically 3 times a year, right? The offseason, when starts free agency, the combine, that area to free agency is when you figure out how much guys are going to cost. Then the NFL draft, which is in a couple weeks, and understanding where I have to draft guys if I want to pick them, right? So it's not what guys I want. That's part of it. But if I want player X, do I have to draft him at pick 28 or can I get him at pick 60? You have to understand the market. And then training camp, understanding waived, guys that get cut, some trades. Those are the 3 main times where you can acquire players. That is the general manager's job. But understanding the market value, to me, is a very, very underrated part about GMs. It's why a guy like Mike Mayock got fired. Because, and it might not have been his fault. It could have been Gruden's. They kept drafting players in the wrong spots. Like, you're taking a second-round player at pick 8. Like, what are you doing? And then you get in trouble when that guy doesn't live up to the hype. Well, of course he doesn't, because the market was off from to begin with. And when you make a trade for any player, whether it's a 5th-round pick or whether it's a 1st-round pick, it's based on the market, right? The reason Davante Adams was going to go for a 1 and a 2 was because in previous years, top-flight players have gone for 1st and 2nd-round picks. Now, I argued like Jalen Ramsey, Jamal Adams, those guys went for 2 1s and a 2. Now, little different. Those guys were younger, first contract, but still, regardless, like the market was the market, and then the Chiefs got a little bit more for Tyreek Hill. And you could argue it's close, but Tyreek has, more impactful career in when he was with the Chiefs. Part of it, he's been a Super Bowl champion. He's played, I guess Davante's played in big games, but feels like Tyreek's played in a couple more. But still, I thought the Packers didn't quite get enough. But regardless, those general managers tried to get a feel for the market. Well, it was reported today by Mike Sando that there was no market for Carson Wentz. There were no teams that wanted him in the league. And part of it was, well, of course not. He was run out of town in Philly, given a new lease on life, goes to a team where the head coach loves the guy. And then by the end of his tenure, which was very short-lived, and obviously his tenure was still going on there, but before he was, quote unquote, put on the trading block, they started bad-mouthing him left and right. So right away, that would take away a large percentage of teams. The Eagles, who invested a ton of cash and a ton of draft capital into the guy, couldn't get him out of the building fast enough. He goes to a really good team. They missed the play and him by the end. Like, that happened. The Washington football team traded 2 third-round picks for the guy. As Mike Sando said, there was no market. And part of the reason with a guy like that, he was really expensive. You see it with Jimmy Garoppolo. Why are people not banging down the doors for Jimmy Garoppolo? Because he doesn't cost $12 million. He costs $27. Even on a lower level, Baker Mayfield. If Baker Mayfield cost $5 million, there would have been multiple teams very interested. He costs $18 million. I think it's like 19. It's like 18.8 or something. It's a lot of money. It's not a small amount of cash. And it's a salary cap league. This is not baseball. It's not the New York Yankees and all these teams that can spend an unlimited amount of money. You have caps on the amount of money you can spend, and some of these teams have run through salary cap space. So when I see the Washington football team commandos didn't know the value, like, that's a poor job by their general manager. That's unacceptable. Like, that's low-level operation. Now, ultimately, let's say Carson is good for them. You could say, well, it doesn't matter. No, it does matter, because they gave up 2 third-round picks. Like, the profit is in the purchase price, not the end result. Like, when you buy a home for $400,000 and then you sell it for 1.5, you didn't make the money when you sold it for 1.5. You made it when you purchased it. So if Carson Wentz is good, they had to invest 2 third-round picks. They didn't need to spend that much. You knew the Colts were getting rid of the guy. They couldn't. The owner couldn't look at him any longer. Said, get this guy out of my building. And then no teams in the league wanted him. So just a bad job. There's reasons average and below average franchises stay low level, and this is a good example. Looking at the Jets, another story that came out of Mike Sando's weekly article was that the Jets struggled to get a lot of free agents that they were interested in. Now, they still landed some guys. The tight end from Cincinnati, Uzuma. They landed Laken Tomlinson. Now, they paid him a lot of money. He's a 31-year-old guard, so I would imagine there weren't that many teams willing to break the bank for a guy over 30 and that you're going to have to pay $10+ million a year. But they did. I think it's pretty understandable why no players, if the money was even remotely close, would want to play for the New York Jets. Let's look at it just from a basic football perspective. I did the math. The last 5 years, over several coaches, from Bowles to Adam Gase to now Robert Saleh, they have averaged a little over 4 wins a season. That is terrible. Like, that is low-level football. In a league full of parity, in a league where, every once in a while you should win 9 games, they're averaging 4.4 wins a season for a half decade with several coaches. So the franchise, for whatever reason, just reeks of losing right now. And then you factor in the market. And one, from a media perspective, it's pretty intense. Like you play for the Jags or you play, hell, even Tampa with Tom Brady. It's pretty low key. I worked for the Eagles. I saw it. It was nuts. That northeastern corridor of Philly, DC, the two New York teams, the Patriots, like those are intense markets. It is not for everyone. The 49ers, one of the biggest brands in the league. It's not, it's kind of chill. It's not, you go to an OTA practice here in a couple weeks, I'll be standing there. There'll be like 5 media members. You go to an Eagles or a Giants or a Jets practice, there are people everywhere. And then you get in these press conferences, it's just intense. So if you get the choice, you would avoid that. Not because you're scared of the media or whatever, but like, why would you want to deal with something if you don't have to deal with it, especially if you're not going to win? So you're like, more than likely we're going to lose. And 2, I'm just going to have to answer all these questions nonstop, and the intensity is never going to stop. And then you also factor in their taxes are outrageous. Like a lot like California, like our taxes are outrageous. But at least if you go to the Rams, or now you go to Herbert and the Chargers, or you go to Kyle Shanahan, you're going to have some success. So it's like, they're offering me the most money. I'm going to take a hit financially because, you're in the top tax bracket. You're going to get hit 13, 14%. Well, at least I'm going to win. If I go to the Jets, I'm going to get dinged financially, and I'm going to lose, and a bunch of media are going to talk shit about me. Screw this. So I don't think it's really that complicated, right? Once upon a time, when I first got to the NFL, they had Rex Ryan. Their defense was legit. They had a top running game. Team was good. So you look past like, I'll take a little financial hit, quote unquote, to go win. People did it for years with the Patriots, for decades, for multiple decades. You went to New England. You took less money usually, but you knew you were going to win some football games and have a chance to play in big games in the playoffs. So you could overlook, whatever the negativity was. And it's not an easy place, right? Bills in your ass. The taxes there aren't, light. So, and the media there is not light, but at least you knew you were going to win double-digit games and be hosting playoff games. With the Jets, is the opposite. You're getting ready for Cancun in early January. So they have a long, long way to go. And the number one question that's going to have to be answered there, like with all these young quarterbacks, Trevor Lawrence, Zach Wilson, Trey Lance, Justin Fields, a little, I guess, Mac Jones, but we saw Mac Jones be a starter for a playoff team. Can these guys play? And it's going to be very, like, of all the non-Mac Jones, like one reason Mac Jones had success, right? He went to Bill Belichick, a team with a good defense and a team with a good running game. That was a great landing spot for a 22, 23-year-old quarterback. Fields went to a place where everyone got fired. The O-line sucked. Trey Lance, a little like Mac Jones, went to a really successful organization and didn't even have to play. Zach Wilson's thrown out of the fire with this shitty team. Now, I'm not even sure he's that good, but still, I mean, most people would have struggled. And Trevor Lawrence had Urban Meyer and the disaster that was the Jags, right? So these were not easy situations. But eventually, if these teams are going to turn the corner, you're going to need, especially the Jets, they're going to need Zach Wilson to be good. Like looking back on Rex Ryan in those couple years they were successful with Sanchez, he didn't really have to do that much. I'm pretty sure they led the league in rushing, and their defense was elite. So none of these young guys, and definitely Zach Wilson, does not have that. They're not going to lead the league in rushing. And their defense last year was atrocious. So they got a long, long way to go. I think it's going to be very, very difficult for Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh. One thing I saw, and I was just texting with a buddy, Peter Schrager of Good Morning Football said that a curveball has potential to happen come the NFL draft. And Trayvon Walker, this guy that played for the University of Georgia, who, unless you're like really deep into the weeds or you're an SEC fan, you probably don't quite know who he is. And he kind of threw it out there that it's not inconceivable that Trent Baalke at the number 1 overall pick would take Trayvon Walker. And he compared it a little bit to, now this guy wasn't the number 1 overall pick, but once upon a time, I think he was like the 7th or the 9th pick. The 49ers took Aldon Smith out of Missouri. And a couple years later, he had more sacks than anyone through 2 years in the NFL. So it was like, what a pick. But at the time, I remember being in the NFL thinking like, that's a pretty bold, crazy pick. And the one thing I will give Trent Baalke credit on, he will take big swings. And he likes taking guys with elite physical attributes. He did it with both the guys out of Oregon, Eric Armstead and DeForest Buckner, in back-to-back years. He did it with Mike Iupati. He did it with Navarro Bowman. He's done it with a lot of players in his tenure when he was with San Francisco. And now he's with, obviously, the Jags, and they have the number 1 overall pick. And one question mark that's kind of out there, and I saw Jim Nagy, who runs the Senior Bowl, compared Aiden Hutchinson, who was rumored to be potentially the number 1 overall pick, compared him to Chris Long. And Chris Long had a really good career. Super Bowl champion, was a top pick, had a decade-plus long career, was a very successful pass rusher. But that was his kind of comp. And it was clear, now Chris battled some injuries, but like if you could redo the draft, Chris Long would not have been the number 2 overall pick. But he clearly would have been a top, probably a first-round pick. And one knock on Aiden Hutchinson is like, how high is his ceiling? And this is a hard balance because I saw this quote. I read it in Peter King's article today because an executive was pushing back on guys with lower ceilings. And basically because we use the word he's an overachiever. And this guy had a good quote. He said, when did being an overachiever become a bad thing? And it's true. Like Tiger Woods is an overachiever. Kobe Bryant was an overachiever. Tom Brady is an overachiever. Elon Musk is an overachiever. Jeff Bezos is an overachiever. The highest level of successful people in any industry, I would consider overachievers. Now, the thing is with pro sports, just because you're an overachiever, if you're an overachiever with Trent Williams or Tyron Smith's talent at tackle, you're going to dominate. If you just have Mekhi Becton's work ethic, well, if you can just stay on the field, you're going to be okay because your talent is so high level. But Mike McGlinchey, who was once upon a time drafted number 9 overall by the San Francisco 49ers, doesn't have elite talent. So he has to be an overachiever just to be a solid starter. And if I could take, and I've seen it before, like 2 guys that were quote unquote super high character guys, super considered overachievers because they lack some of the physical attributes, were Solomon Thomas and Clelin Ferrell, one out of Stanford and one out of Clemson. They were both drafted. I think Solomon was 3rd overall, and the next year Clelin Ferrell was the 4th overall pick to the Raiders. Neither of them are very good. And it's not because of lack of effort. It's not because of lack of trying. It's they simply lack the physical attributes. Now, when I watched the kid at Michigan, and I watched a lot of Michigan games, to me, he's much more talented than both those guys. But he doesn't have the longest arms, and people just wonder, like, is he a dominant player? If you're just drafting a guy because you know you can get a 10-year player, is that the right move? When you know you can just, like, if I could tell a guy before he gets up to an at-bat, right, Bryce Harper, I can say, would you take a stand-up double right now, or would you take your chances of hitting a home run in the 9th inning to win the game? I bet most of the elite players would say, give me my opportunity to hit a home run over just like, I'll put you at second base, right? And I think most general managers that have some cojones, that have some stones, want to take a big swing. Now, I text a couple people and they thought it would be a pretty bold move. This Trayvon Walker guy, 1-year starter, not the most productive guy, but he's 6'5", he's 270 pounds, he's got 35.5-inch arms. That is crazy long. And he ran a 4.5, an absolute freak show. Now, we've seen it go both ways. We've seen freak shows get drafted really high and be complete busts because ultimately you have to play football. But this guy was not playing at like Cal Poly. No offense. They're actually on the come up. This guy was a starter at one of the best defenses in the last 20 years. So he has a lot of physical attributes, and that defense was not just letting you fly up the field and chase the quarterback, right? So you have to balance how good can this guy get? Because to me, part of drafting someone really high, like it's why I like the 49ers taking Trey Lance over Mac Jones. Because ultimately, it's not about even right now. It's about the next 5 years. Now, that potential gets a lot of people fired, especially in the sporting world, right? Potential. Eventually, you got to have results. You got to get the job done. You got to be able to play. But look at the Bills are a great example. They went all in on potential. And to me, potential, when you have the overachieving mindset, and this is where the scouting department has to do a good job. What type kid is he? What's his character write-up like? What do coaches say about him? Just what's the person? Because if you feel very good about the person, then I like taking chances on the elite talent or the guy with the elite attributes. But when the person is, it's like, he's kind of average worker, doesn't love football, I stay away. So I don't have that information on this player, but it wouldn't shock me if Balky takes a swing for the fences. And the other thing is the draft that's right around the corner. Ultimately, I would say even way more than free agency. Ultimately, to me, free agency is to supplement your team, because ultimately you build your long-term sustained success, unless you're the Rams, through the draft. And let's face it, they kind of have too. They just use those picks to trade for players. Stafford, Jalen Ramsey. I mean, their best player is a drafted player in Aaron Donald. But part of the reason the draft is so powerful, because I get you on a cost-controlled number, even if you're the number one overall pick, but second, third, fourth rounders for years. So I have you under cost-controlled contract at a relatively low number. And it's right around the corner. This is the lifeblood this is what scouts and general managers work all season long for. And it's not very far away. And the paralysis by analysis, and I saw Daniel Jeremiah tweeted out, I think Phil Savage, who's a buddy of mine too, kind of the fog of this time of year. And what he means is we are so far separated from the time these guys last played a game. So all you've had to analyze since, the last game was played in like early January, but most players in the draft did not play in the national championship. A lot of them played in bowl games before Christmas. Like, that is a very, very long time ago. So all I'm evaluating these guys on now are some all-star games, but mainly the combine and pro days. And I think you can overvalue things that don't necessarily matter, where when I loved a guy in the draft process during the fall, going into the school, I'm telling my bosses about him. They like the guy. We really like the player. Let's say he's a second-round player. I'm like, this guy can really play. I will pound the table for him. And then he goes to the combine or he goes to the pro day and he puts up shitty numbers. And that immediately scares people off. It just does. It's a natural reaction. If I thought this guy's a second-round player and then he runs really slow, it's like, well, is he really going to go in the second round? And then you have to balance, well, can we get this guy in the third round because we still like him, or are we off the scent? And I think teams right now are trying to build their board and try to convince themselves, are we staying on this player or are we pivoting to other players? And there's no right or wrong answer to that right now, but you figure that out in 6, 8, 10 months. Like, once you see these guys play as rookies, you're like, yeah, we screwed that up. Or yeah, we overthought that one. Or yeah, we did a good job. We stuck by our guns. We let the tape speak for itself. A lot of teams, what they do is, if you want to change your draft grade, you lock it in during the season. So if I give a guy however you numerically quantify a player, right? If it's based on your own team, right? He'd be a starter for us. He'd be a functional starter. He'd be a backup. If you do it that way, if you do it on a round grade, like I think the guy's a second rounder, I think he's a third rounder, you lock that in usually like in early January. Then if you want to change your grade during this process, the combine, the pro days, you have to put in like a separate report and a separate grade. Where when I was with the Eagles, you could kind of fluidly do it. So it's like, I thought this guy, I did it with Keenan Allen. I love Keenan Allen. I had a first-round grade on him. And then he ran slow, or he wouldn't run. I kind of forget now. And I ended up putting a third-round grade on him. And it was just stupid. Like, I watched the guy play. He was a dominant player from the moment he was basically born. He's gone on to have an elite career. But I overthought the process. And I think that can happen. But a lot of these teams now have taken that ability away because, of the way that they do their draft grades. And then last but not least, just the quarterbacks. I think the quarterback inflation is out of control. Peter King wrote that he thinks 3 guys to go in the top 20, or maybe an executive told him 3 guys to go in the top 20. I saw Greg Cosell said he wouldn't think it's crazy if 5 guys go in the first round. You got to be very, very careful, because if you draft the wrong guy, and when you overdraft quarterbacks, if I overdraft a defensive lineman, that guy can still play for me. That guy can still rotate in. If I overdraft a wide receiver, I can still use that guy. When I overdraft a quarterback and then it turns out that he's terrible, he becomes a backup, and only one guy can play. So this quarterback class coming into the season, throughout the season, we all viewed these guys. The most talented guy, Malik Willis, as a major project. Kenny Pickett is like a poor man's Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins went in the 4th round. Now, I understand that Mac Jones is in that kind of realm too. He went 15th overall. Mac Jones is a way better player than Kenny Pickett. And then you got guys like Desmond Ridder. And some of the comps I've heard are like Marcus Mariota and Dak Prescott. Well, Dak Prescott also went in the 4th round. And if we could redo Mariota's draft, no way he goes in the 1st round. So when I hear some of the comps on these players, I go, well, none of these guys would have gone in the 1st round. So I understand the inflation with that position is understandable. It's real. But when you make a investment, like right now, if you're going to buy a house at the peak of the market, better be prepared, because if shit goes south, you could be way in over your head. And it's not something easy to pivot off of, right? And that, to me, that's quarterbacks. You can miss at other positions, but when you miss at quarterback, because ultimately you're going to have to force that guy into play. Once I draft a quarterback, I would say in the top 50 picks, that would include the early in the 2nd round. Look at the Broncos with Drew Lock. You're just in bed with the guy. You got to play him. And then it kind of derails everything. And when you draft a guy in the 1st round, you have to play him, right? There is no getting around it. Maybe you can redshirt him a year like Trey Lance did last year, like it sounds like people want to do with Malik Willis. Let's say the Steelers drafted him. They start Mitch Trubisky. But for the most part, within 12 months, that guy is your starting quarterback. And then typically he's going to start for you for a couple years. So if he sucks, you're in trouble. Because like the Titans got kind of lucky, right? They made a trade for Ryan Tannehill, and then it was clear Tannehill was just a lot better than Mariota, and they were able to pivot. Right? Look at the Bears. I mean, the Bears had Mitch. It did not work, and then they ended up with Fields, who I really like Fields, but who knows? What if he's not any good? They just might be in quarterback purgatory and be stink forever. So there is just an element when you invest at the quarterback position, especially high. If I take a guy in the 3rd, 4th, 5th round, whatever, guy can be a backup. I take a guy in the top 32 picks. Like I said, I'd even argue 50 picks, but definitely a 1st round pick, because that means he has the 5th-year option. The clock starts immediately. The pressure starts immediately, and the fans are locked into wanting to see that guy play. And it's hard to blame them, because it's like, well, you guys like this guy enough to draft him this high. Let's see him play. And let's face it, these guys, this quarterback class was not touted highly for a reason. The talent just isn't really there. And if we end up seeing 3 of these guys go in the top 20, we're going to see a lot of general managers, in my opinion, lose their job relatively quickly.